good afternoon, everyone. Hello and welcome. I hope you're all safe and healthy. Well, I believe that Sengupta is here with us. Hello?
Yes. Hello,
Yes.
everyone.
Hello, Ray.
Hi. Hello, everyone. It's very
Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
Thank you for joining us. I believe you're in UK now.
Yes, I'm not.
So, how is UK now?
It's still very cold, actually. One would expect that it would be warmer, but it's not. But yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so it's been a while since the last time I faced the students directly like this. But this time I will not give a lecture. This time I will introduce you to our amazing lecturer. So we have Ms. Sangupta. Thank you very much again for joining us this afternoon. So just to give you a brief profile of Ray. Hopefully I pronounce your name correctly and then read your CV correctly as well. So she has a very amazing profile. She's now waiting, are you still waiting now? M.Sc in Evidence-Based Social Intervention and Policy Evaluation from the University of Oxford. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so she graduated and earned the degree of Bachelor of Economics, Honors, from Sri Ram College of Commerce, the University of Delhi. And she also secured Oxford Weidenfeld Hoffman Scholar. And she was also a consultant at Invest India, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India. And she was also Analyst Social and Economic Empowerment at IWEEK Global Limited. And she's currently an Economic and Statistic Analyst at Asian Development Bank. I can go on and on, the whole day to read her CV, but today you'll have more important session, which is the lecture from Ray, and the title will be Post-COVID Business Recovery, Continuity and Resilience, Outlook of the Global Level. Yeah. So, well, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Lusiantoro. I am currently the head of Global Relations and Mobility Office at the Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Gadjah Mada. I might see you again because I still have 2 more sessions to join with you guys. But for now, I will leave the floor to Sengupta. Please, you have 1.5 hours. Yeah, so you have until 5 p.m. Jakarta time or Yogyakarta time, and you will be accompanied by Nafisa, our operator here. So please feel free to arrange your session, right, for the next 1.5 hours. So from me, thank you so much for joining us once again, and the floor is yours. Right, thank you.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction and for the warm welcome. And thank you everyone for joining. It's very nice to be able to meet you all, even though virtually. And I look forward to getting to know all of you in the course of this session as well. So for starters, what I'm going to try doing is that I'm going to try sharing my screen. I would request this to be as interactive a session as possible. So please feel free to use the chat option on Zoom if you're joining online. If you want to raise a point, if you want to ask a question, or if you want to answer a question, feel free to raise your hands. And if there are facilitators in the room, maybe they can help me in getting the students or the participants to answer as well. But the point of the session is for it to be as interactive as possible, because the topic of the discussion is post-COVID recovery, business resilience, and continuity. So automatically, this is a challenge that we are all living with today. This is a world that we are all living in today, a post-pandemic world, and all of our lives have been transformed in different ways. Some of us have gotten used to working from home. Some of us have perhaps even got the disease and have recovered. Some of us may have changed working styles or business styles as a consequence of the pandemic. And as a result, each of our lives has been irrevocably shaped and changed by the pandemic. So, as a consequence, all of us are stakeholders in contributing to the conversation about business resilience, about continuity, about all of the topics that we're about to discuss today. So, feel free to make your voice heard, to ask questions as much as possible, to brainstorm with me, because a section of our discussion will be about brainstorming, to delve deeper into the conversation, to ask each other questions, because only through such kind of dialogue and discussion will we be able to kind of move forward, and will we be able to kind of brainstorm and kind of have better ideas on a post-pandemic world. So just a question regarding, and perhaps Nafisa can help me a bit in this. Is everybody like having, is everybody joining in some form through Zoom, or are there some people who are not joining on Zoom?
Yes, some of us are via Zoom. I'm on
All
Zoom.
right. All right, perfect. No problem. Great. So I'm going to try sharing my screen, and hopefully all of you will be able to see it, and then we can proceed further. Just give me a thumbs up when you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Great. All right. So here we are to discuss post-COVID business recovery, continuity, and resilience. We're looking at it at an outlook at the global level. My name is Sangupta. I'm here to represent the Asian Development Bank. I work as a consultant with ADB, and I work in both the input-output analysis teams as well as the global value chain teams. And much of our work in ADB centers around understanding the ways in which countries can respond to crises, countries can be more resilient, and economies and businesses can shape their trajectories in ways that can ensure that their profits are sustainable in the future. So this is broadly what we'll be discussing in today's session as well. So without further ado, I'm going to be moving on to the next slide, wherein I'm going to be talking about the outline of today's session. So today we'll be asking 4 broad questions. We'll first be asking, how did the COVID-19 pandemic impact businesses globally? So here we'll be conducting a mapping of impacts of sorts. Next, we'll be talking about how some businesses were more resilient than others. And here we look at the business strategies that were employed for resilience. Next, we'll look at how can sectoral opportunities for recovery be leveraged. So we'll be looking at how policies and strategies for business recovery can be implemented across 4 key sectors, or with particular focus on Indonesia. And finally, we'll be talking about what are the key support factors required for business continuity, where we'll be talking about certain other environment level or setting level variables required for business continuity. That's the broad outline of the session today. Again, just to reiterate the house rules, feel free to ask as many questions as possible. This is an open discussion, and feel free to stop me at any point. I will also stop myself at certain points to give you guys the opportunity to ask the questions, but always have the questions in your mind. So as a broad discussion point, before I kind of move to the next slide, if I ask you broadly, what do you think were some of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on economies or on businesses? If you can just think from the top of your head, what would they be? You can use the chat to answer, or you can even unmute yourself if you want. Some broad level impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on economies. I'm sure all of you have read the newspapers. I'm sure all of you are abreast on various kinds of impacts that were created. But it doesn't have to be a particular figure or a number. It can just be the broad impact. So what do you think was a broad impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on, let's say, economies or on businesses? How do you think businesses reacted to the COVID-19 pandemic? All right, there were supply chain disruptions, there was unemployment, there was, yes, reduced purchasing power, absolutely. Inflation across the world, absolutely. Anything else? What about output? What about GDP across the countries? Production was stalled, yes. GDP declined, absolutely. Great. So you would automatically realize that there was a large scale impacts across a number of sectors. So when we talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts, we must understand them from a multidimensional perspective. And in order to understand them from a multidimensional perspective, we have to have a transdisciplinary approach to understanding the impacts, to mapping them, and finally to addressing them as well. So all of you are absolutely right. The impacts that you mentioned in terms of falling GDPs, falling sectoral outputs, including somebody mentioned tourism, supply chain disruptions, production disruptions, all of these were very, very significant impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we'll just delve a little bit deeper into these impacts in the next slide. So the first impact was that there were wide-ranging impacts on the country's economies. So as you know, even currently, economic risks and uncertainties continue to remain very high. Even right now, we're not completely out of the pandemic, though there has been vaccination, there has been large-scale boosters even in certain countries, but still economic uncertainties and risks continue to remain very high. And output losses for developing Asia amounted to 6 to 9.5% of the regional GDP in 2020 and 3.6 to 6.3% in 2021. So as you would recall, many of you mentioned that there was declining GDP, which was a challenge. And even in this context, the output losses were a major problem across developing Asia. And for Indonesia, the forecast GDP growth for 2020 was 5.2%, while the actual GDP growth rate was minus 2.1%, which means that there was a decline in the GDP growth rate for Indonesia as well. So this implies that there was a broad decline in outputs, there was a broad decline in growth rates across countries, and there was widespread economic risks and uncertainties. And when all of this is happening at a macro or at an economic level, larger economic level, automatically the individual units in the economy, mainly households and businesses, were affected as well. So let's understand how. There were adverse impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on MSMEs. MSMEs, micro and small and medium enterprises, in the form of significant production and supply chain disruptions. So we have surveys in Lao PDR, in the Philippines, in Thailand, which showed that after the virus outbreak, at least 40% of MSMEs suspended operations, and a very similar share reduced their workforce. So because of the pandemic, because of the mobility restrictions, there was a large section of MSMEs across multiple countries in Asia that suspended operations, that stopped their production, and also resulted in large-scale layoffs and unemployment as well. And the reasons why was because the businesses faced a lack of access to loans, they faced the lack of access to startup capital, they faced reduced savings and reduced sales. So automatically you're understanding that the business environment is no longer favorable for investment. It is no longer favorable for production or expansion. It is a situation wherein businesses are largely contracting their operations, they're suspending their workforce, they are not having access to loans or startup capital. And consequently, it is a situation of large-scale economic uncertainty and risk. And if we move a little bit beyond Asia as well, there are certain surveys that have been conducted by McKinsey, by PwC, and you would observe that, for example, in the first survey, which was done by McKinsey, in a survey of 300 senior executives in Europe, 42% said that the COVID-19 crisis had weakened their company's competitive position. And in a survey of 2814 global business leaders, 70% said that the COVID-19 pandemic had a negative impact on their organizations. So this is from the PwC survey. So automatically you will realize that this is not only a challenge in terms of the businesses that are being faced in Asia alone, but it is something that is being faced worldwide in terms of Europe, in terms of a global scale. So the kinds of impacts that were faced by economies and by businesses are very global in nature. The lack of competitive advantage, the losses to companies, the negative impact in terms of various organizational features were global in nature. And at the same time, they were more pronounced in certain parts of Asia as well. And that's what the broad sort of understanding of today's workshop will be based on. Now, in this context, and I understand that, many of you are students of business, some of you are students of economics and other subjects. So you would be having a broad idea on what would be some of the strategies that perhaps businesses could adopt in such a context to be able to mitigate these challenges, because they're dealing with suspended production lines. They're dealing with, let's say, rising unemployment and, the supply chain disruptions. In this context, if you were a business owner, what would be some of the strategies that you would employ to save your business in a post-pandemic world? And I would give you all 1 minute to think and to brainstorm a bit, and then we can discuss this on chat, or if you want, you can unmute yourselves as well. All right, so Jovan is suggesting a simple SWOT analysis. For those who don't know what a SWOT analysis is, it is a strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats analysis, where you understand the different kinds of strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats that are persisting within your organizational framework, and understand the ways in which the strengths can be leveraged and the weaknesses can be mitigated. So that's a very interesting first step. What are the other ways in which you as a business leader or as a business owner could mitigate the challenges posed by the pandemic? And this could be anything. I mean, you all are young students right now. So clearly you are coming with innovative ideas. And that's the kind of bold, innovative, disruptive ideas that are required to save businesses in a post-pandemic world. So it could be a simple idea also, but I just want you all to think about the ways in which you can address this challenge. How would you, let's say, deal with the supply chain disruption? Would you keep your business in person? Would you change it into an online platform? Would you change the product line? Would you expand a certain product line? What would you do? All right. So Mahatma is suggesting restructuring and allocating the overall production budgets. Somebody also is suggesting restructuring company marketing to maintain the old customers and attract new customers. So automatically there is a kind of retention of older demand and expansion to newer demand. Rinaldi is suggesting a different approach in order to keep the business running. A lot of hotels offer their employee services to homes, selling their supplies to smaller businesses. So automatically there is a need for innovation. There is a need for business model innovation that is emerging at this point. Anything else? If you had to expand your business to new markets, how would you do that in the context of the pandemic? Vivi is suggesting doing a risk profile and assessment. This is similar to the first suggestion on the SWOT analysis as well. John is suggesting a change of business model. How would you change that business model, John? And people who are suggesting expanding to newer markets, how would you expand to newer markets? What would be the newer marketing strategies you would employ at this point? Does anybody think that there is a need to have a risk management team? Is it important to have a risk management team to?
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. What I would do if I was a business leader, I would probably adopt a lean operation.
You would end up, sorry?
I would adopt a lean operation. You know what lean operation is?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes. So they basically combine Toyota production system and just in time. So in order to improve their supply chain.
Right. That makes sense. All right. Anybody else?
Okay, thank you.
Saeed is suggesting to accept the change in business environment, and because resistance to change is a problem, so innovation and change management should be a first priority. Absolutely. It's important to accept that the change is happening, whether it's a crisis or whether it's any other kind of change, and to have the necessary bandwidth to deal with that change. Adzra is suggesting to expand the market target by analyzing the customer's journey and needs. All right, so these are all excellent suggestions, and I think that the world is in safe hands if these are the future business leaders who are willing to take on the role in terms of dealing with post-pandemic challenges and stresses. So that's absolutely right. All of these were some of the ways in which the major business leaders across the world actually dealt with the problems that we mentioned right now. And we'll go into the strategies in the next slide as we speak. So the survey of 300 businesses in Europe, which I spoke about, which McKinsey had conducted in 2020, highlighted that business model innovation was the key differentiator for resilience during the pandemic. So for whichever businesses were resilient, they were more likely to have conducted a business model innovation. And the survey respondents in this survey mentioned that the survey respondents who said that their companies addressed the crisis very effectively were 1.5 times more likely to report undertaking business model innovations. So clearly you would understand that the people who undertook business model innovations were the ones whose companies were actually resilient in the long run. And the probability of resilience rose with the business model innovations that were conducted, right? So clearly, many of you have mentioned business model innovation as a key way in which one can adapt to the new environment. And there are 5 broad focus areas which effectively sort of demonstrate the ways in which this business model innovation took place. So let's understand the 5 broad focus areas. The first broad focus area is by providing new digital experiences, products, and services in response to changes in customer behavior and needs. So you would realize that because of the pandemic, in-person experiences became limited and the world moved to a digital space, whether it be education, whether it be the workspace, whether it be employment, etc. And so many, for example, sports and entertainment venues have moved to a full digital experiences. Digital technology providers are now providing on-demand fitness through digital means to capitalize on the category's surging popularity. So automatically there is a growing transition towards digital experiences, and the companies who were actually able to make this kind of a transition were the ones who were more resilient in the long run in making sure that the business model innovation took place and in making sure that their companies stayed afloat. So that's the first broad focus area. The second broad focus area which companies focused on for business resilience was new partnerships, both within and outside the industry. For example, insurance groups have partnered with connectivity providers to set up virtual clinics. Pharmaceutical companies have been teaming up directly with healthcare centers to accelerate vaccine development. Sports leagues have banded together with software companies to create virtual reality experiences. So automatically very innovative, previously not considered partnerships are now being developed. And it is important, therefore, to understand how the key needs that are being fulfilled by one's own company are actually in line with the products that are being provided by another company, and therefore creating a partnership therein. So the companies who were able to create partnerships were more resilient in the context of the pandemic. The third focus area is supply chain and operating models adjustments to manage risks. So many of you mentioned conducting risk assessments. Many of you mentioned conducting SWOT assessments. So automatically there is a need to understand the ways in which risks can be managed. There is a need to understand the ways in which the supply chain can be calibrated to manage and moderate risk factors. So companies, for example, are trying to balance the need for just-in-time delivery with protection against delays or shutdowns by securing alternative sources of supply and ensuring that the labor force can continue to operate. So automatically, there are ways in which the supply chain is being moderated and modified by looking at alternate sources of supply, so that even if there is a delay or shutdown in one area because of the pandemic and because of mobility restrictions, it does not affect the overall supply chain, and the risk is therefore well managed. The fourth focus area is sale model changes. So many businesses have had to adapt the way they market and sell their offerings, from logistics companies that have introduced contactless delivery to restaurants that are shifting to home delivery and pickup orders. And business to business sales have likewise moved to largely remote and digital models. So automatically now the ways in which you can push your product to the customer, the way you can sell your product has also changed. You're no longer selling it in person, you're selling it through e-commerce platforms, you're selling it through either home delivery in certain cases, you're selling it through contactless deliveries. So automatically the sales are also changing in to suit the pandemic related needs. And the final focus area is faster product development through rapid iteration. So what this means is that, for example, telecom companies working with insurers and healthcare providers have quickly responded to the pandemic by creating telemedicine applications to assist in remote COVID-19 testing and diagnosis. So you would realize that even the ways in which the vaccines have been developed across the world have been on a very stringent timeline. They have been through quick and rapid iterations, and they have been very fast in order to deal with urgent medical needs. So these are the 5 broad focus areas that companies across the world who have proven to be resilient have focused on in order to ensure business model innovation and in order to ensure that they have stayed afloat in the context of the pandemic. So this is something that has emerged, therefore, as best practices in terms of managing the risks associated with the pandemic and ensuring that both the people and the profits of the company remain stable and sustainable. At this point, are there any questions? If you have a question, you can put it on the chat. If you don't have a question, you can just write no in the chat box. So it seems that people do not have questions right now, but in case you get questions in the future, feel free to ask them whenever you want. We are now going to move to a section on sector-specific impacts. So we're going to be looking at 4 broad sectors. We'll be looking at tourism, we'll be looking at agro-processing, we'll be looking at garments, and we'll be looking at electronics. And you'll understand the ways in which each of these 4 sectors was affected by the pandemic and the ways in which recovery can take place through certain policy as well as business recommendations. While we are discussing the business recommendations, we'll be broadly looking at recommendations for the context of Indonesia, which is based on ADB's analysis and research. And we'll also compare the recommendations with countries in the region, including Cambodia, Vietnam, etc. So first context is tourism. I think many of you mentioned that the tourism industry in Indonesia was affected in the context of the pandemic. And I would like to kind of quantify those impacts a bit. So in the context of the tourism industry, there was a decline in international arrivals in 2020. As you know, there were large-scale lockdowns and mobility restrictions imposed across the world. And as a consequence, there was a decline in international arrivals. It ranged from 84% in Philippines to 75% in Indonesia. So automatically, there was a rapid decline in the number of passengers who were coming in, and therefore a rapid decline in the revenue from tourism that was emerging as well. In relation to that, there was also an increased demand for health and hygiene, as well as environmentally sustainable tourism. So for example, according to a study conducted, 72% of tourists claimed that they would consider the destination's social responsibility towards providing the spread of COVID-19 before deciding to travel. So many tourists therefore claimed that they would actually, their decision to travel to a particular destination would depend on the health and hygiene standards that were employed in the context of tourism in that case. And there was also a need for environmentally sustainable tourism. As environmental awareness is growing, as awareness of climate change is rising, there has also been a transition towards a greater demand for environmentally sustainable tourism. According to the World Economic Forum's Travel and Competitiveness Report in 2019, Indonesia was placed in the bottom 20% of environmental sustainability in the world. And therefore, there is a need to kind of unleash greater potential in this area for environmental tourism in Indonesia's context. Furthermore, there was also a decline in long-haul international tourism. What we mean by long-haul international tourism is that there was a decline in the long-distance travel. So people prefer to travel to places closer to their homes. They prefer to undertake domestic travel. They prefer to undertake travel that was maybe to the nearer countries or to the nearest states within their own countries or to the nearer regions. So long-distance travel was less preferred. Short distance and proximity travel was more preferred. So in case earlier the tourists were traveling from longer distances to Indonesia or to other countries, now they were no longer undertaking that long distance travel because of pandemic related fears and anxieties. In this context, what do you think would be some of the ways in which one can respond to these challenges. How do you think tourism sectors across the world, and particularly in the context of Indonesia, can actually tackle some of these challenges and ensure that business resilience for the businesses within the tourism sector is maintained? I will give you all a moment to brainstorm and to think a bit, and then to sort of let's brainstorm and understand, because only through that can we come up with the right kind of solutions and suggestions. If you were a policymaker figuring out the ways in which businesses in the tourism industry in your country, for example, could tackle pandemic related impacts, how would you tackle it? If you could use the chat option to answer, that would be very nice.
Okay, let me use the example of Kenya,
Yes.
of my country, Kenya. Unfortunately, in Kenya and most African countries, the sector of tourism, it has been relegated mostly to foreign tourists and not to domestic tourists.
Yes.
And therefore, we can see that during the pandemic, tourism declined over 90%. So that international travel was cut off. And therefore, in order to sustain tourism in my country, what I will do is that I will try to promote the tourism sector to be inclusive of the local people, so that at least to make it more affordable to the locals to travel within the country than by instead relying on foreign tourists only. That is my take.
That's an excellent suggestion, John. And I think that's one of the suggestions which we'll even eventually go to when we're talking about promoting domestic tourism as well, because that's something that is not only, and I appreciate that that's in the context of Kenya, but it's even a suggestion that is very relevant to the Asian context as well. So thank you so much for that suggestion. It's very relevant. Anybody else who wants to contribute? How else can you deal with it? Promoting domestic tourism and domestic tourism opportunities is one way, but how else can you, let's say, how else can you promote hygiene or health in the context of tourism? How can you ensure that environmentally sustainable tourism is a priority? You can use the chat option to answer if you want. So, okay, we have suggestions coming in. So, Azra is suggesting that the following of health protocols, promising private or personal comfortable tourism to the customers, obligating every tourism worker to be vaccinated. So essentially creating vaccination standards and health protocols is an important component. I completely agree. Absolutely. Anybody else who wants to add a suggestion to this? Afif is suggesting.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think when it comes to tourism, I'd like to propose an idea that we use the local philanthropy organization that the first aim is to restore the nature, to basically save the nature. So what I propose is that the tourism should work together with the local philanthropists to create a channel of demands that aims to promote saving nature. I think that is my suggestion here. Thank you.
Right, absolutely. So having local partnerships and partnerships with local stakeholders, including philanthropists, is a very valuable suggestion. And kind of having the kind of local embedding of tourism goals is also very interesting. So I'm going to quickly kind of summarize these suggestions in the next slide. So the first thing that is very important to do is to restore demand. And to do that, you need to create safety standards and certificates. You need to plan for gradual and targeted opening. As John mentioned, you also need to promote domestic tourism as well. Some of the countries that have done it in this manner, for example, the amazing Thailand Security and Health Administration, or SHA certification, focuses on 10 tourism industry business types to ensure that they commit to strict safety measures such as ventilation, cleanliness, etc. Similarly, Indonesia has a substantial marketing movement that includes social media campaigns and promotional programs such as Bali Rebound. And its Ministry of Tourism also maintains the wonderful Indonesia website, as you all would be knowing, which talks about the different ways in which domestic tourism can also be promoted. So the first thing is to restore demand and to ensure that the safety standards are maintained and domestic tourism is promoted. The second thing is to build new channels of demand. So instead of just relying on older channels, it's important to have newer channels of demand by focusing on new forms of tourism like ecotourism and health tourism. So it's important to kind of have these kind of tourism that are also in place. For example, countries like Cambodia, Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand all have natural and cultural resources, which essentially implies a strong potential for focus countries to develop new tourism hotspots. And through this, they can rely a bit on the previous infrastructure while also developing other enabling conditions. So creating the newer channels of demand is the second way in which tourism can be sort of expanded and promoted in a post-pandemic world. The third thing to do is to build capacities to support future demand. So it is important to not only build the non-digitized skills capacity of various business owners and business workers in tourism industry, but also to unleash a form of digital transformation through the fourth industrial revolution technologies. So, for example, we are living in a world where currently 82% of the travel bookings in 2018 were completed online or via mobile devices without the human interaction. And in the context of the pandemic, this kind of reliance on fourth industrial revolution technologies, on digitized technologies has been far greater. So automatically, there is a need to train workers, there is a need to train business owners on transitioning to business, digital-driven business processes so that they can also make the best use of the available demand for tourism services across the world. The fourth kind of sort of suggestion is that we have to increase industry resilience. So it's not only important to mitigate the past impacts of the pandemic by creating new demand, by restoring existing demand, or by building capacity, but it's also important to create business resilience by improving data collection facilities, by making data available for faster crisis response, and by developing a multi-partner crisis management strategy. So the risks of pandemics are always present, and even if it's not a pandemic, it can be other kind of crisis such as climate change, recession, etc. So always having data available to manage the crisis, having a multi-partner team available to mitigate the impacts of the crisis is extremely essential. For example, while Indonesia and Cambodia do publish monthly reports on tourism statistics, other countries like Myanmar do not. And several Indonesian experts have argued that the lack of real-time economic indicators have made it challenging for businesses to plan varying scenarios during the pandemic. So it's important, therefore, to have data available and to improve data collection and availability for faster crisis response. So summarizing these recommendations and their relevance to focus countries, if we're looking at Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, Philippines, and Thailand, you would observe that these recommendations are very, very relevant in the context of Indonesia, with high to medium relevance across most of these recommendations. And therefore, building new channels of demand, restoring demand, building capacities, and strengthening industry resilience are some of the ways in which sectoral opportunities for business recovery in the context of tourism can be leveraged for Indonesia. At this point, are there any kind of questions which I can answer? If you have a question, you can put it in the chat box. If you don't have a question, then you can just write no in the chat box.
I've got a question.
Yes, please.
Okay, I can see in one of the recommendations, I can see that you're focusing more you're focusing more on issues that I believe they can hinder reopening of the tourism sector. For instance, I can see there is an insistence on on further vaccination, especially on the side of health sector. Now, but you understand, as human beings, not everyone was in favor of vaccinating themselves. We need vaccinating themselves and as a country, if a country insists on taking all those measures, can't you see that it will hinder development and growth of the sector?
If you could just repeat the last part of the question. I understood the point about the vaccination. What's the second part you were asking?
Measures that, can't you see that insistence of further health restrictions upon tourists will rather slow the growth of will rather slow the growth of the tourism sector, consider that some tourists may decide that if you insist on us as tourists having all these uh, having all these issues, they therefore the first will decide rather to go into other places and not to visit a particular place.
Right. Thanks for your question. So 2 points. So as a policymaker, the policymaker has a kind of responsibility to ensuring the social good of all citizens or all members of the community. And therefore, when one is requesting people within the community to undertake vaccination, it is generally not only in aid of their own health, but also in the aid of other people's health, because once a person is vaccinated, then their chances of contracting a disease or a severe form of the disease are much less, and their chances of transmission of the disease are also less. So in that context, yes, there can be resistance on part of people within the community to undertake vaccinations, particularly, but it is also the responsibility of the policymaker to create that awareness about the benefits of vaccination, because as we know, it is only through vaccination that much of our economies are currently back on track once again. In fact, the rate of vaccination is directly proportional or is directly related to the kind of GDP growths that have been pursued across countries. And we'll be tackling that in the next section as well when we talk about support factors. So I think that in this context, yes, there can be resistance to vaccinations, but it is important for policymakers to still create awareness on the importance of vaccinations to be able to ensure safety, not only for individuals who are against vaccinations, but also for the entire community. And with respect to tourists feeling averse with respect to the kind of stringent protocols employed, so studies have shown that tourists they prefer stringent protocols as opposed to less stringent protocols. And in fact, they will be more likely to visit a country if there is a kind of strict health protocol, because they would also be fearing for their own safety. So creating safety standards is in a way attracting tourists rather than reducing tourists, because that's what the empirical evidence shows, that tourists in fact prefer an assurance of safety and a management of pandemic related disease risks as opposed to there being no restrictions. Moving on now to the next section, which is on agro-processing.
I'm sorry, ma'am.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe just for confirmation, ma'am, if I may, ma'am. Previously, I think you said that the Thailand have a good domestic tourism. Is it right, ma'am? If I may, ma'am.
So I had mentioned that Thailand has an interesting way of health administration.
Yes, ma'am. So in the previous slide before this, there is a recommendation from the Asian World Bank. I just want to confirm that basically the recommendation is based on the relevance. There is a high, medium, and low. So if the Thailand is the recommendation is basically low, so it means that Thailand is already good. Is it, ma'am? If I may, just for confirmation from the World Bank.
Yes.
Oh,
currently.
Okay, ma'am. That's it, ma'am. Just for confirmation. Thank you, ma'am.
Moving on now to the agro-processing sector. So the agro-processing sector is an important contributor to regional GDP and employment. As you can see from the diagram, in the context of Indonesia, Southeast Asia's agro-processing industry creates a large section of employment in the food value chain. So you would understand that it's an important contributor to regional GDP and employment, and particularly in the context of Indonesia, wherein a large chunk is actually of employment is being created in the Indonesian context from the agro-processing sector. And in the context of Southeast Asia, the agro-processing industry represents around 8.5 million jobs, which is about 2.5% of Southeast Asia's labor force. So you would clearly understand that this is a very major sector in terms of contributions to both the GDP and to the regional employment levels. So how did the pandemic affect this kind of a sector? The pandemic led to lower demand for food and beverage products, resulting in lower revenues for food processors. So automatically, we're dealing with a context wherein people are losing their jobs. We're dealing with a context wherein businesses are cutting back on supply chains. So automatically, at a household level, there is low purchasing power due to job losses. As a result, people are no longer purchasing processed food. People are purchasing maybe homemade substitutes. People are purchasing less food or beverages. And consequently, the demand for agro-processing products is falling. On the supply side, there are also challenges because there's a breakdown in the supply chains, which are worsened by the mobility restrictions. So automatically, you will realize that the agro-processing sector, even though it is a major contributor to employment and to the GDP, it is facing many challenges on account of lower demand for products and on account of supply chain challenges, which in turn are creating challenges in the ways in which consumers can purchase products or even access these products. So if you were a policymaker in this context and you were dealing with the agro-processing sector, clearly you would understand that it's a higher priority sector for your country. You would understand that this is something in which you must intervene because a large section of the workforce is engaged in the agro-processing sector and would likely lose their jobs due to the lower demand. So how would you deal with this kind of a challenge? You can use the chat option to answer. Rinaldi is suggesting adapting to a supply chain that is efficient in nature in order to reduce costs, prioritizing domestic goods over imported goods. All right. So efficiency in the supply chain is required. Anyone else? How else would you deal with this kind of a challenge? It's clearly a priority for you because a large section of your workforce will lose their jobs because nobody's buying enough food or beverages. International demand has also fallen because people across the world are losing their jobs and there is lack of purchasing power. Okay, produce the things that are on high demand, make the wastes from agro products sustainable through reusing and recycling. Absolutely. So Azra is suggesting a more sort of circular economy kind of model wherein the waste from agro processing is used as other kind of product making in the form of recycling and reusing. Anyone else who wants to add to this discussion? Subsidies, increasing demand, shifting products of production from cash crops to food crops. All right, all very valuable suggestions. So I'm just going to, before we kind of proceed any further, I'm going to highlight 2 or 3 key challenges that are faced by agro-processing businesses. So when we talk about the key challenges faced by agro-processing businesses, and I'm sharing this information so that we can nuance our recommendations even further. When we talk about information from the PwC survey and businesses across the world were asked about the top 3 challenges faced by them in the agro-processing sector as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. The supply disruption of raw materials was cited as the major challenge. Labor restrictions impacting production was cited as the second challenge. And the consumers panic buying and hoarding food, as well as not being able to access food, were cited as the third challenge, and so on. So you would understand that these are challenges once again on the supply side, which is the first 2 challenges, and the third, fourth, and fifth challenge, which are all at 57%, are demand side challenges. In this context, are there any other recommendations you want to add in view of the new knowledge that you've received regarding the challenges faced? How else would you deal? And I would like to hear from other people who have not been answering so far, because the familiar names are coming up in terms of those who are answering. So those who have not answered so far, please feel free to use the chat option to answer. How else would you deal with the challenge of, let's say, consumer panic buying, consumers being unable to access food, reduced consumer ability to purchase, and so on?
Hello.
Yes.
So I think that because of the low demand, I think that this is a good opportunity for companies to produce more organic products, like organic farm, organic plants, because they are generally slower to produce and could bring out higher quality, more nutritious food and beverages product. And because health is in very high demand and people are starting to look after it, I think it also will be a good idea too.
Right, right. So shifting to organic production, though of course that requires additional forms of investment in certain cases, which may not be possible in a post-pandemic world, but of course that can be an option that can be explored. So other people are suggesting that companies can reduce the profit margin of their product and add more value to the product in order to increase the demand for the product. That's of course, again, a useful suggestion. So I'm going to kind of move on and summarize some of these recommendations in the next slide. The first thing to do, and as many of you mentioned, is supply chain efficiency. This can be done by developing reliable data management systems, enabling easy information access, and promoting cross-border trade. An example of a data management system is provided by the G20 Ministers of Agriculture, who launched the Agricultural Market Information System, which is an interagency platform to enhance food market transparency and policy response for food security prices. Similarly, the information access, and an example comes from Bank Indonesia, as well as the Pusat Informasi Harga Pangan Strategis Nasional, which was launched, who have launched a mobile app to collect pricing information for 10 commodities from traditional markets. So you would realize that the different ways in which supply chain can be made more efficient, and there are already best practices available, including that from Indonesia, for improving information access and for facilitating reliable data collection and management. The second thing, as many of you mentioned, is increasing value add in the industry. This can be done by expanding the product range and sales channels, by attracting investment, as well as by providing tax incentives. For example, you would now realize that many consumers across the world are choosing, as some of you mentioned, organic food, free from gluten food, functional foods, reformulated foods, and so on. In Thailand and Malaysia, the health and wellness category is expected to grow by 5% and 9% respectively between 2017 and 2022. So automatically, these are some of the ways in which sales channels can be further expanded, and value addition in the industry can take place by looking at alternate products that can be sold in the organic or in the free from gluten and free from other kind of contaminants ranges. The third thing is improving agro productivity. This can be done once again by the provision of digital as well as non-digital skills training, the involvement of the private sector, and creating leadership capacity in agro businesses. So it's no longer important to just have agro businesses, but also to have leadership capacity within them, so that when there is a crisis, then the change management or the crisis management can take place in a very sustainable manner. For example, in Australia, the National Careers Institute has tailored programs for production managers in food processing, covering topics such as leadership and agribusiness management. The fourth and final recommendation, of course, is building industry resilience. For example, to be resilient against future outbreaks, it is necessary to invest in national and international programs to increase adequate biosecurity arrangements and support the country's capacity to manage sanitary and phytosanitary risks. So automatically, you realize that the COVID-19 pandemic has also been a kind of biosecurity risks. So when countries are engaging in agro-processing industries, there is a need to streamline the ways in which scientific procedures ensure that biosecurity risks are mitigated, that there are adequate protocols in place to reduce any form of risks that can take place in the context of biosecurity from the agro-processing industries. And summing up these recommendations, we once again have a comparative summary across 5 countries. As you would observe, that most of these recommendations are of high to medium relevance for Indonesia's context. We will now be moving on to the third sector, which is the garments sector. And we'll be first discussing the sector-specific business impacts of the garments sector. Okay, I think we have a question coming up before that. I think Saeed has asked, as labor restrictions impacting production is one of the important concerns, wouldn't policy changes to ease the process of re-entry of migrant workers be an appropriate response? Yes, absolutely. I think that would be also a very appropriate response, but it should also be coupled with the training in digital and non-digital skills so that the migrant workers who are able to re-enter the economic system are also able to contribute and value add to the sector through their new skills and capacity building. So moving on now to the third sector out of our 4 sectors, which is the garments sector. So you would observe that in the context of the garments sector, there were supply chain challenges again, wherein 30% of the inputs into the garment production was sourced from countries with closures, and consequently any kind of major disruptions in these countries with closures led to major supply chain challenges for the various countries who were producing garments. At the same time, the pandemic also saw a preference for sustainable fashion. So there was greater focus on reusing rather than manufacturing. For example, you would know that in Indonesia's context, online startups like Rentique and Style Theory provide garment rental services to consumers. At the same time, there were also widened disparities. So not only was it a context wherein there were supply chain challenges, but there were widened disparities as well, wherein the poorly implemented welfare standards for garment workers led to this kind of disparities. And many of the garment workers are largely women, and who not only faced exploitative work conditions, but also an increased in unpaid care work at home, because now they had to manage their homework as well in the context of the pandemic. At least 36% of respondents from a survey of 307 women garment workers in Cambodia reported that they bore a heavier workload than men during the pandemic, and 13% identified an increase in unpaid care work among the top problems from the pandemic. So automatically you would realize that the widened disparities on account of the pandemic, on account of the increase in unpaid care work, was an important challenge that was faced in the garment sector, which also threatened business resilience and which also threatened the female garment workers to a greater extent. In this context, when there are supply chain challenges, when there is a preference for sustainable fashion, and when there are poorly implemented welfare standards, how would you as a policymaker intervene to ensure that the garment sector is not only able to have business resilience, but also able to ensure social welfare? How would you contribute to this policymaking in this context? Any question? Anybody to suggest? Okay, upskilling labor so that they can produce better and also adapt to new conditions. Absolutely. So skill development and capacity development are important ways in which the contribution can take place. Anything else? Yes.
So yeah, because one of the focuses on reusing, I think as an individual, I can try to sell some of my old clothes that I don't need anymore in like a thrift style of shop, in order to reduce the waste and reduce manufacturing.
Absolutely. Sustainable fashion should be promoted, and ways in which waste management can happen is also important. Conducting an in-depth research on various types of government businesses in the area, analyzing SWOTs, and providing business solutions for workers' welfare are also important suggestions. Sourcing of materials locally is an interesting recommendation as well. Shifting to produce high demanded products such as masks and medical clothes are also interesting suggestions. Just to summarize these suggestions in the form of the following slide. The first way in which garments industry can be saved and sort of made more resilient is by upgrading the vocational curricula and improving competitiveness, by bridging the infrastructure gaps through PPP funding. So automatically we are looking at a context in which it's important to have greater vocational skills training, greater vocational training and skill development for the government workers, bridging infrastructural gaps by the involvement of the private sector. For example, the Thailand's Office of Vocational Education Commission has developed several certificates and diplomas in vocational education for the textile industry. In Cambodia, the Garment Manufacturers Association has introduced the Cambodian Garment Training Institute with government support to ensure that the graduates meet industry needs. The second way in which this can be recovered, the business recovery can take place, is by expanding markets. So one can leverage cultural related garments, one can transition from mass to made to measure products. For example, as you would know, in Indonesia promotes Muslim fashion wear and batik, where margins are potentially higher. The government has also organized annual Islamic fashion shows like the International Indonesian Islamic Fashion Fair to showcase their products internationally. The third recommendation is raising industry resilience by promoting domestic production of related agricultural products, transitioning to a circular economy, and reforming the labor welfare system. For example, in Indonesia's context, the Standard Industri Hijau, which is the Green Industrial Standard, contains provisions on raw materials, auxiliary materials, and energy requirements for the management of wastes across the garment sector. Similarly, in the context of domestic production, Indonesia's Ministry of Industry encourages the domestic textile industry to use locally grown natural fibers like banana and pineapple to reduce the country's dependence on polyester and rayon imports. So automatically you would realize that we are talking about a context wherein raising industrial resilience can be happening in various ways, such as by promoting domestic production, by promoting environmentally sustainable methods through a circular economy, and by reforming the labor welfare system. The final recommendation is pursuing flexible business models, which is necessary to respond to future shocks. This is by equipping workers with transferable skills so that they can change their skills and adapt in line with the changing consumer demands. In Indonesia and Cambodia, garment factories have attempted to produce PPE. However, they have faced raw material shortages and difficulties in getting certain certifications. So in this context, even if one sort of is not able to fulfill a particular business priority, which happened in the case of the PPE, it is necessary for the workers to have transferable skills so they can change and adapt to newer circumstances to suit the consumer needs. So these are the 4 broad suggestions for sectoral recovery in the garment sector with a focus on Indonesia. Again, this provides a comparative summary of recommendations. Once again, most of these recommendations are high degree of relevance for Indonesia, and some of these are medium degree of relevance for Indonesia. Moving on now to the final sector, which is the electronics sector. The electronics sector is a significant contributor of economic growth and has contributed to 2% of the GDP in Indonesia, in Thailand, and in the Philippines. So as you could see from the graph that total employment in electronics industry is provided across a range of Asian countries. And even for Indonesia, a substantial section of the employment is provided by the electronics industry as per 2019 figures. So along with Vietnam and Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia hire a significant number of workers in the electronics industry. At the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated digital transformations globally. So you would realize that this is a time wherein we're moving to the digital sphere, we're moving to digital ways of working, studying, learning, and therefore the COVID-19 pandemic in many ways has accelerated the digital transformation. At the same time, the following challenges have also emerged. So there have been two broad challenges. One is that there have been production delays. Once again, there have been supply chain disruptions, and this has led to a domino effect on product launches, wherein the suppliers have been failing to meet the rising consumer demand. On the other hand, because most people are now moving to digital platforms of working and studying, there is a largely rising consumer demand for digital products and electronics due to newer ways of working, evolving government policy. Even in the context of government policy, many of the cash transfer programs or direct benefit transfer programs take place through digital platforms. For example, in the context of India, a large section of the cash transfers are now moving to digitized means. So having electronic devices, having digital means is an important component of living and working and existing in today's post-pandemic world. And the changing consumer demand, wherein there's a rapidly rising consumer demand, has been met with a shortfall in supply due to supply chain challenges. In this context, what do you think should be some of the ways in which we can mitigate these impacts of the pandemic on the electronics sector? Naturally, you would understand that the electronics sector is an important driver of economic growth, not only in Indonesia, but also in the neighboring countries and in the larger region. So what do you think would be some of the ways in which you as a policymaker would be able to mitigate the challenges posed by the pandemic and would be able to fulfill the larger consumer demand that has been created for the purposes of, in the context of the pandemic? All right, so developing human resources to support the growth of digitalization by partnering with institutions and companies, giving adequate training, constant training, so that they can adapt to the newer ways of working, thereby fulfilling consumer demand. Absolutely. Anything else? Okay, decreasing electronic devices taxes, enabling pre-ordered or limited quota, enhancing cooperation between the government and the electronic sector to reduce shocks like supply of raw materials needed for the production and labor. Absolutely. So greater partnerships, greater capacity building and training, all of these are very important and relevant suggestions for the electronics industry. So what we'll be discussing right now are two broad recommendations. The first important recommendation in this context is upgrading SEZs or special economic zones. So this is important because through SEZs, you can actually have zone specialization to maximize industrial linkages. And because electronics not only have a kind of domestic demand, but also foreign demand, it's important to have SEZs under which there is a greater impetus provided for the production of electronic devices and electronic components and products. And this can be done in many ways. This can be done, for example, by having zone specialization. For example, in India, which has ambitions for net zero imports in electronics, it emphasizes the development of coastal-based electronic SEZs. So one of the states in India, which is Tamil Nadu, is developing 4 electronics manufacturing clusters in Chennai and other parts of Chennai by 2023, in addition to 8 existing electronic hardware manufacturing SEZs in the state. So similarly, it's important to also be having stringent design requirements for SEZs. Currently, several SEZs are hampered by suboptimal planning and designs. Many of these failures can be traced to factors like poor site locations, shortage in utilities, or red tapeism, and therefore the countries should focus on the challenges and should incorporate more stringent design principles in future SEZs. So automatically you would realize that there is a need for a targeted approach to the production of electronics products, whether it be through the creation of well-designed SEZs, by adopting zone specialization, by developing supportive policies for electronics, as some of you mentioned, and by increasing government-industry collaborations, as some of you mentioned as well. The second thing, as many of you mentioned in the beginning, is training. So developing human capital. This can be done through dedicated government strategies by partnering with industries and learning institutions, incentivizing local companies to engage in research and development. So for example, one of the ways of developing human capital is the example comes from the Philippines government, wherein the Philippines launched strategies like the Philippine Development Plan 2017 to 2022, which aims to accelerate human capital development, and the National Technical Education and Skills Development Plan 2018 to 2022, which serves to prepare the workforce for new technologies. So in similar ways, it's very important to have human capital that is developed in order for the digitization process to be complete, and in order for the benefits of digitization to be unleashed adequately. So once again, this is the summary of recommendations, and many of these recommendations are of high relevance to Indonesia, as well as medium relevance to Indonesia. This concludes our section on the 4 sectors of garments, agro-processing, electronics, as well as the first sector, which was tourism. In this context, are there any questions? Otherwise, we'll move to the last section of the workshop. I think Aisia has raised the hand. If you want to put it on the chat, it would be very helpful. If you have no questions, you can just write no on the chat.
Thanks. Hello. So from what I've observed, ma'am, for your explanation on the opportunities for business recovery, most of them are not free, and they may cost a lot for business to implement them. Some businesses that got hit hard because of the pandemic makes them cannot afford to do such things. Do you think that government should take part to subsidize those businesses to recover? If yes, what is the best way for government to choose which business or industry that will be the prioritized receiver of those incentives that will be given? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. Of course, I recognize that at an individual level, it is often difficult for businesses to be able to implement these strategies because they themselves are not being able to stay afloat in the context of the pandemic. So yes, there is a greater need for government support and partnerships to be created. At the same time, I would also emphasize that there are certain actions that businesses themselves can take. For example, the 5 focus areas that we discussed in the beginning, which are inherently actions to be taken at the level of the businesses and which the government cannot support to a large extent in that context. So it is a mix of both. It is a mix of business level actions to be taken as well as larger governmental support to be granted. And in the context of governmental support to be granted, I think one of the ways in which the government can help prioritize the allocation of limited resources is understanding perhaps the sectoral contribution to GDP or the sectoral contribution to employment, understanding the kinds of workers who are employed in that sector, the level of income of those workers, the kind of socioeconomic categories of those workers, and therefore to identify the workers in need again within those sectors as well. And those are the broad guiding principles that can help inform government decisions on allocation, particularly in the context of scarce resources in the context of the pandemic. Moving on now to the last section. So in the last section, we'll discuss 3 broad support factors that are important for business continuity, because we've already discussed the strategies for business resilience, we've discussed the sectoral opportunities for business recovery, and now we're discussing certain larger environment level factors that are necessary for businesses to be able to proceed, for businesses to be able to kind of actually unleash these changes. So as you mentioned, it's not only sufficient for businesses to take the actions, it's also important for there to be certain setting level variables, certain larger environmental factors that will help make these changes possible. The first thing is fiscal space. A country's fiscal position has determined its ability to mitigate the economic and social impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So automatically, the level of government spending that has been made available is a major determinant of the extent to which the pandemic's impacts can be mitigated. And you would realize from the graph that different countries have been able to provide different levels of support to in response to the pandemic, in terms of government spending. So in certain countries like Georgia, they pursued fiscal resilience strategies prior to the pandemic, and this in turn helped them to weather pandemic-related shocks. However, in most countries, tight fiscal constraints, obligations to service foreign currency denominated debts, and falling inflows of foreign currency have severely limited the room for fiscal maneuver. So in the larger context, there has been limited fiscal spending across most countries due to other constraints posed by previous debts or by the falling inflow of foreign currency. However, certain countries who were able to provide fiscal spending, who were able to pursue fiscal resilience strategies, were more effective in dealing with the pandemic than less effective. So in the context of implementing sectoral business strategies, it's also important to have a larger context of fiscal resources provided by the government to support these strategies in the first place. The second key factor for business continuity is vaccination. So vaccination changes pandemic management. It helps to reduce hospitalizations. It helps to reduce severe illnesses and deaths. And if you can see from the graph that there have been varying rates of vaccination across the Asia and Pacific region. The number of COVID cases in a particular country is negatively correlated with its GDP growth. However, we are living in a world wherein there are uneven vaccination rates, which create a kind of economic divide. The concentration of vaccine production in North America and Europe, combined with the early procurement and stockpiling of vaccines by various developed countries, has often led to delayed vaccine access across the Asia-Pacific region. Inequitable access to life-saving vaccines has been made worse by a lack of effective mechanisms to transfer knowledge, technology, and other resources. And therefore, going forward, it is important to adopt a whole of society or a whole of government approach to ensure widespread vaccination and universal access to healthcare. So currently, we're living in a world wherein those countries who have higher rates of vaccination are more likely to be able to circumvent the impacts of the pandemic on their businesses and on their economies. But uneven rates of vaccination are posing a challenge, and therefore going forward, a more comprehensive and holistic approach to vaccination and universal health access is required. The final support factor is digitalization. Digitalization drives the pandemic response. For example, and many countries have used digital platforms for test and trace purposes, such as the Republic of Korea. They have been used by governments for the purposes of providing cash transfers. For example, Bangladesh turned to digital cash transfers for low-income families. Similarly, Indonesia also launched a digital service which provides income and training assistance for laid-off informal and formal workers. Digitalization is also important from the perspective of e-commerce to provide supplies and so on. And they've also helped governments, as I mentioned, in dealing with the negative shocks of the pandemic. At the same time, we are living in a world wherein there is a digital divide. This implies that currently 1 in 2 people have access to the internet, and the availability and affordability of digital connectivity rapidly varies across countries. Therefore, even though digitalization poses immense potential for the purposes of dealing with the pandemic, for the purposes of mitigating pandemic-related challenges, for the purposes of assisting governments in dealing with the pandemic, the digital divide which currently persists is a second form of divide. First is by vaccine, second is by digitalization. And therefore, the affordability and availability of digital connectivity varies, and thus only certain countries are able to reap the full benefits of digitalization. So moving forward, if businesses have to recover in a given economy, not only is it important for the economy to have adequate vaccination rates or adequate fiscal resources, but also a certain degree of digitalization to support the transition to pandemic impact mitigation in a more sustainable manner. With this, I would be closing today's session. So this is a set of future reading material that you all can have a look at. I've also shared this presentation with the organizers of IWEEK, so they can also share this list with you. This is a list of reports that you all can refer to in the future, which provides a more detailed and comprehensive summary of what we have just discussed in the context of post-COVID business recovery, resilience, and continuity. Some of these reports are by ADB itself. Others are the surveys we refer to, which is PwC and McKinsey surveys, all of which focus upon managing business recovery in a post-COVID context. With this, I would like to end my session. Thank you so much for being such a patient audience and for listening. And if you have any other questions, this is the time to ask. So we have our first question coming in. So the first question is that in the presentation, you mentioned that one of the opportunities for agro-processing is to have a cross-border trade. Should the company keep going with the cross-border trade if there is scarcity of product in the domestic area, while there is a greater opportunity for a business if they conduct the cross-border trade? So, of course, a company's priorities are determined by not only their own business requirements, but also the kind of responsibility and priorities that they have for their domestic production as well. Again, it's not for one to say whether one should engage in cross-border trade if there is domestic scarcity. Of course, it's also important to ensure that domestic scarcity is maintained, sort of mitigated through domestic production processes. So I think a blended approach is important. I think the government and other stakeholders should support companies in helping to fulfill domestic demand by expanding domestic demand channels, by looking towards new forms of domestic demand, while also ensuring that the channels of cross-border trade are kept open to keep the inflow of foreign currency in place and to create greater fiscal space to have more fiscally robust government policies in the future. So I would not say that it's a one or the other situation. I think both of them should be kept in mind as policy priorities for the government and business priorities for the company. The other question that has come up is that I'm going to take the next question, which is about, I think Shi has asked. Today's supply chains are becoming more sophisticated, but also more dependent on timeliness. For example, problems with the supply of chips have led to the production standstills in many automotive companies. How do you see supply chain management operating in the post-pandemic era? For example, in the terms of IR4 or smart supply chain. So yes, timeliness is a huge factor in today's supply chain. And, even when there is one raw material which is sort of affected in the context of supply chain management, there are many other challenges that happen in the forward stages of the supply chain as well. So I think in the context of the fourth industrial revolution strategies, I think one of the ways in which technology can play a very important role is to have databases of inventories and stocks, is to have real-time monitoring of raw materials, is to have real-time monitoring of supply of raw materials through various technological advancements. So even though timeliness is an issue and timeliness is a priority in the current age, I would say that prioritization of timeliness is accompanying a growing impetus on technology itself, which is creating ways in which timeliness can be mapped, measured, monitored, as well as promoted. So yes, in the context of a smart supply chain, I would say that timeliness is something that is a factor that has to be considered, but also is a factor that can be easily addressed through adequate information access, management of databases, and management of stakeholder expectations around timelines based on technological advancements. The third question is about how does business adapt with these solutions? Will they follow government rules and obligations, theoretical directions, or will, I'm so sorry, I just moved a little ahead, or will they innovate by themselves? So I think, Azra, as I mentioned before, it's a mix of the two concepts. businesses have to have the sort of necessary innovation on their own scale as well, because not everything can come from the top. So there has to be a bottom-up approach from the businesses, which has to complement the top-down approach of policy. So from a bottom-up perspective, businesses must have a necessary hands-on approach to innovation, because they themselves have the greatest and the most in-depth understanding of the ways in which their business can do better. No amount of policy can actually determine the ways in which a particular industry or business will do better. So innovation must happen at the ground level for a business, in the form of creation of a risk management team, a risk management strategy, in the form of having the necessary levers to move to a digitized space, etc. At the same time, it is also important for the government to provide the overarching framework, the supporting infrastructure to make those transitions. If an industry or a business is looking to move to digitization, then it is a business level decision that it is making for innovation. But to support that innovation, to support that business decision, a larger policy context is required for digitization to take place in the first place, maybe by the provision of subsidized broadband subscriptions, or by the subsidized mobile subscriptions, and so on. So it's a very multi-stakeholder response is required. It's no longer important for stakeholders to work in silos. It's important for them to work in a multi-stakeholder dynamic environment to deal with a challenge that is multidimensional in nature. I'm going to take 2 more questions. I think there is one more question. Okay, so there's something about rare earth minerals. In the context of electronics, it's foreseen that rare earth materials of which electronics are dependent highly will face supply shocks. So how can businesses overcome this? So I think an important factor to be understood here is the merits of reusing, is the merits of a circular economy. It's really important for even electronics to be sort of decomposed to their primary component parts after they reach a stage of obsolescence, and then to use those component parts to create newer electronics. So that's one way in which the supply challenges can be mitigated. Another way is, if you would notice that electronics are slowly becoming more efficient in the ways in which they are produced. They are smaller, sleeker in size and shape, so they require less and less material from the existing supply of rare earth materials, which are short in nature. So innovation in terms of utilizing less raw materials, reusing the raw materials, sourcing alternate raw materials and substitutes are some of the ways in which the shortages in rare earth materials perhaps can be mitigated in the context of the post-pandemic world. Any other question? I think there's one more question, which is about digitization and Olympics. When it comes to digitization, do you think major sports events like the Olympics and Asian Games should use metaverse so they don't rely on TV cables and pay-per-views? So I don't think this is in the ambit of the discussion, essentially, in terms of what we can suggest as ADB of what one should be doing. But having said that, I think it's important for there to be access to the given digitized platforms. So if there are certain platforms which are promoting greater access across a larger section of society, then perhaps those should be promoted more than others that restrict access to viewing certain internationally sort of programs. With this, I think we can close the session. We've also gone over time. But thank you all for being a really, really wonderful audience and for listening to me. It's been a great pleasure to speak to all of you and to hear your suggestions and comments and recommendations. You all have been a very participative audience. You all have been very, very interesting in the ways in which you've contributed to the discussion. So thank you so much for being very, very participative, very, very active in your discussions. You have also provided many recommendations, which we later came to discuss in the slides. So, which gives me hope that all of you are actually people who will be very, very successful business leaders and policymakers in the future. Well done on that. Thank you so much, IWEEK, for having me, and all the best from all of us at ADB.
Right. Thank you very much, Rai Sengupta, for a very valuable lecture. Yeah, I'm sure that we have learned a lot from this session this afternoon. Right. So thank you so much again, Rai Sengupta. So we'll see you probably next time.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you so
The
much.
next IWEEK maybe. Or maybe in ADB. So thank you so much for the knowledge, and thank you everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow and good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.